Hi, Amy. Welcome back to the Horsewise podcast. As always, we love having you here because you are so low key and so very shy. So I'm hoping you can come out of your shell today
I
for
was
the
just
first
trying to
time.
remember what gang signs I know to throw up as my greeting, but I didn't remember any. So
Oh, so that's okay. So you have a poor memory and you're antisocial. So that's an interesting combination, of course.
I'm a
Uh,
cat.
yeah, you are. You are. So before we actually hit record, we were talking about the topic that might be fun to discuss would be this idea of listening to your horse. People will hear this advice a lot. It's a nice, big, broad, sloppy term that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So I think that was a great topic, and I wanted to go ahead and let you kind of lead on that. What are your thoughts, and what have you seen out there in terms of that topic?
Well, it is a great topic because I came up with it.
Of
So
course, of
just
course.
leading with that.
Yeah, I thought you were shy, so I'm disappointed already, but go ahead.
Well, I am really humble. So
Oh, good. Are you blessed as well?
humble hashtag blessed. Live, laugh, love. So listening to the horse is so vague that, like everything in the horse world seems to swing from one side of the other. And, 10 years ago when I was teaching clinics and stuff, in any given clinic I was doing, people were fighting with their horses. Like, he has to canter, he has to listen to me, he has to. And I was begging people to just let the horse have a little bit of leeway sometimes, that he was incapable or frustrated or confused, right? And fast forward now, 10 years from now, then now timelines get mixed up. I live in many timelines at once.
Sure.
It's hard, but I manage somehow. So now it's hard to get people to push their horse through anything. And what listening to the horse has turned into for many is the minute there's a moment of confusion, tension, or lack of interest, they stop everything.
Mhm.
Which I think can be very harmful to the horse's confidence and physical balance as well. So there is a middle line in there somewhere. Um, and I always think of my kids, like my kids can talk, and I do listen to them because they make me.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, what they want is not what they need, and that's where we have to. I hear them, I love them, I acknowledge them, but if they want candy for breakfast, and I hear that and let them have candy for breakfast, then there are going to be health ramifications for listening to that.
Mhm.
So I think what listening to the horse really means is being the steward of the horse, not the giver of whatever the horse wants. And that's where we have to use discretion and get good instruction. That just because they want something, we have to decide, what does that mean for the long haul? What does that mean for the long-term comfort and well-being of this horse? And that's why being a steward means making hard decisions sometimes, or managing a yes or a no, or please try again, or I hear you and I'll back off a little bit, but we're going to keep going in this direction, or wow, we need to back off entirely based on some clues that I've read.
Right. And I think it can be difficult for whatever reason today for some horse owners to discern the difference between a signal that the horse is going in a dangerous direction, meaning that the feedback that they're giving is that they need to stop or pause is because there is a genuine trouble that is coming
Mhm.
up. And unless you understand how to guide and direct the horse through that trouble, it is not a bad idea to redirect or take a moment, exit gracefully, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
But there's that, but that is not the majority of the time. Um, the majority of the time, at least in my experience, has been that the horse will show confusion or frustration or quote resistance, which is a whole word to unpack on and of itself, but that the horse is not automatically doing what you're asking.
Yeah.
And people will see that. And it might be in that moment that there is a little moment of you have to provide some clarity to the horse.
Yeah.
And by clarity, that means you might have to firm up a little and just make that amplify your volume, so to
Mhm.
speak. That doesn't mean you have to scream or hit the horse, but some
Yeah.
people are really uncomfortable with any type of raising the volume. And they think that if they had done it correctly, or if it was right for the horse, that there would never be any of these moments of confusion or what
Yeah.
appears to be resistance from the horse. And that's, to me, a very interesting zone, having
Well,
worked with horses that are a little troubled myself. So,
here's a perfect example of that, which is a really, really common one. So one thing that I always tell my students is the horse cannot be straight without parameters, right? Straightness has to, it by definition has parameters that you are between right and left, top and bottom, right? So it is impossible to straighten a horse without parameters spatially. And a lot of my students will have horses that bump them and move them, right? And that's to me something you clarify today, right now. And guess what? They aren't going to love it because that's what they do. I don't have to go after them or beat them up, but like let's say here's the horse. Are you going to use the audio of this
sure.
only?
And visual too. Yeah.
Okay, so here's the horse and here's me. If the horse keeps doing this, then that parameter is constantly smudgeable, right? And so what I tell my students is just be here. This is a no option. Don't let the horse move you and be done with it. And they're
Right.
going to fuss and try it a little bit more, and you just don't move, right?
Right.
But the horse will display stress behaviors because what has always worked is no longer working. That is a stressful experience, but they will move through that stress much faster if now this is the new norm and you don't fudge that.
Right.
But what makes horses more stressed is, oh, kind of worked, kind of didn't, sort of worked now. Yes, it now really works. And then when the horse amplifies their stress behavior, okay, we're done talking about this. You can do that because I don't like your discomfort. The horse never has clarity. They get more stressed and then they can never be physically straight. So as long as there is some wiggle room in that parameter, the horse will not think of anything except the exit,
Right.
which means they cannot focus, they cannot be calm, they can't do anything. And that's one of the hardest things now to explain to people is if you have constantly smudged those parameters, yeah, you're going to have to be a little more clear now. And that sucks, but that is what it is, you know. If you didn't move all over the place, that wouldn't have been necessary, but now it is. So just get it done, do it now and be done with it
Right.
instead of being stressed for 6 more months, you know?
Right. And I think there can be this misinterpretation that it's somehow a kindness to be smudgy,
Yeah.
to, if I just say it more quietly,
Yeah.
that then the horse will get it. And it, again, their language is not the same as ours.
Yeah.
So what we think of as soft, they may see as non-existent, as not a signal at all. And you talk about, I agree 100%. You can't have a center, a straightness without parameters to know where to be. It's
You know,
also, go ahead.
your smudginess, you said the smudginess is softness. It reminds me of a boss that I used to have that was Southern, and Southern people don't ever talk, what's the word I'm looking for? Directly. He was horrified at my speech. That I was just like the rudest woman on earth. But to me,
You
I could,
are, but
I know I am. That's true. But I also never could figure out what he wanted.
right,
And so he would walk by a pasture and say something like, "Well, it sure would be nice if that was clean." And I'd be like, "Yeah, that would be nice." And I would just keep walking. And I had never understood that that was my job. You know what I mean? Because my job was to ride the colts. So I thought he was talking out loud, right? And stuff like this would happen, and then he would come back down and just ream me out. And to me, it was like it came out of nowhere, right? Like, what was that? Whereas he thought he was softly hinting at, and he would use those analogies in horse training with his students all the time. And it dawned on me that that's what people do. They think they're being soft and kind when they're being so unclear that the horse is in the dark and then suddenly in trouble, right? Which is what happens all the time where people are being soft. They think they're being soft, but they're not guiding, they're not being clear, they're not giving any parameters. And the horse is like, yeah, it would be nice if that were clean too. What are you going to do about it? Right.
right, right. What does that got to do with me? Yeah, and your smudginess.
I
That's
got clothes
funny.
to ride, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
Sure,
yeah.
we'll
Thanks
clean
for
it.
sharing. Thanks for sharing. Right. I agree with that. It's interesting. The indirect. I was I was being taught a few years ago by a really cool horsewoman, and
It was me, wasn't it?
no, it wasn't. I said it was a cool horsewoman. Come
Oh,
on.
okay.
I'm
Not a
sorry.
really rude one.
Yeah, no, not a rude one.
I
I
don't always
was like,
listen very well.
geez. And it was Kathleen Beckham, actually. And I'd gone out
Okay.
there with a friend, and I was just, how I hadn't ridden with someone in a while. And I went out there, and she wanted me to work with a colt in the round pen. Actually, it wasn't a colt. I don't think it was a full colt. It was a horse that was maybe a little withdrawn or whatever.
Yeah.
And I went out there and I wanted to be kind of soft,
Yeah.
And she bellowed at me. She's like, "You're more fit than I am, and you're walking like an old damn lady. What's your problem? He doesn't know what you want." And I'm like, "I'm sorry, could you stop sugarcoating that? Because I'm not
Yeah.
getting it. And
Right.
but she was right, and I hadn't even realized it. Like with the war horses here, I work with these older race horses a lot. I can be pretty direct with them, right? I
Mhm.
know I can't ruin them. And I just kind of in myself, but I was like, oh, this is one of Kathleen's nice horses. Like I should be really soft and
Oh
quiet
yeah,
and
yeah.
everything. And she was totally dead on, and I hadn't realized how much I had done that. And yet I'll always tell the people that I work with, my students and clients, one of my favorite things to tell people is don't be creepy. So go up to the
Yeah.
horse, but don't be creepy.
Yeah.
Don't be a stalker.
Yeah.
And I was doing that, in my own kind of new scenario, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting how that works. And it made me laugh, and I'm like, oh, you're right. I'm gonna go up now. I'm gonna boss this horse around. But it was fun. It was a fun moment. And we can't tell sometimes that we're doing that, right?
Right.
Whether a teacher, a student, or most teachers are students, right? The best teachers are students anyway. And so, how can we teach if we're not perpetually learning so that we can then in turn understand and keep growing and help people,
Well, I
along?
think I think that's one of the reasons why people are so prone to being over what they think, right? Is because in order to be soft and clear requires intense self-awareness and practice, right? Like every year I go back to Brent Graff's to do the young horse class. Those horses you have to be soft with or you'll flip them over. But you have to be clear or they'll be petrified. You can't be creepy, right? And every single year it's like awareness boot camp for me. I mean, I leave exhausted and I work on it year after year after year, and it's still really hard for me. And so it's just the same thing is true with riding. People who are like, I'm really soft. What they mean usually is I don't touch anything because that's creepy and hard and I don't like the responsibility. So I'm just going to kind of let my horse flop around. And then when you have to clarify that, I'm going to feel bad. So I just rather not do that, right? Because in order to ride like on contact with actual soft hands, you have to close them.
Right.
But the softness has to be a body wide thing, which takes extreme practice and awareness. And it is a very difficult process of learning. So it's easier to just say, I have soft noodle fingers, you know?
Yeah. My thing is that you put on your soft
Yeah.
face, and
Yeah.
then you forget the rest of your body. So you're going around with this kind of, drippy look on your face and drippy fingers, but nothing's really happening that's
It's
helpful
because
to
I
the
spiked
horse.
your drink.
Yeah, with that too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Everyone who's going to ride with Amy in 2025, do not accept a beverage from her. Just don't do it. Don't do it. Keep your distance. Um, and I think also, I don't know quite what this difference is. Like you said, 10 years ago, you were seeing people maybe hammering on their horses,
Oh,
wanting
yeah.
response extra fast. And now maybe whether it's a cultural thing or it's as we've learned more about horsemanship or learned more about neuroscience or whatever, we're wanting to be as compassionate as possible. But the lack of clarity is a hardship for a horse. And I would say no animal likes to be confused, but horses really hate to be confused, is my observation. It's
Absolutely. Yeah.
something that really scares them. And if you don't close any of the doors, then all of the doors are open. And that's where you'll get that sort of edgy, I don't know where to be. I'm looking for it. They're all which exit to take. And they really need you to help them understand where there is a closed door. And closed doors are very helpful.
Hmm.
Um, and again, maybe that is something that there's a little bit lack of comfort with. Or if you haven't, and I'm not saying, I know you've worked with really intense problem horses. I would say I've worked with horses that have a mild degree of trouble.
Hmm.
They can be very expressive about that trouble, but they're not going to take it the full distance as a truly troubled horse would be. And
Yeah.
so I have had that experience where you have to be extremely clear for a moment and the horse goes, oh, thank you. And then they kind of fade back and they're able then to focus. And then you realize, oh, this wasn't what I thought it was.
Well, that's where feel is so important because I have had quite a few very troubled horses that the switch on them is so fine that if you close a door, they are like, I'm going to bowl you over.
Right.
So, you have to be really careful because if they have been perpetually overfaced, overpressured, then that's a hair trigger. So when you're teaching those parameters, you have to be way more fluid and way more flexible. And there might be a time where you try to close the door and they're like, I'm going to murder you. And you're like, okay, okay, okay. We'll talk about this later in a different way, right?
Right. Right.
That there is absolutely a time and a place for that, right? Or if you overpressure a horse, and the line for that, every horse is different, but some of those retrains, they have been their brains have been rewired, right? So you have to be very feeling in putting those parameters, but the parameters are an essential part of their training. You just have to be more flexible. And what I always tell my students when they get a new horse is boundaries, clarity, and settling, then snuggling, not the other way around. Because the
Right.
first thing people want to do when the horse comes in is go in and sit with them, snuggle them, smush them, feed them treats. And the horse is, moving to another culture, learning another language, settling into a herd with no idea of what the language is and what they're expected to do. And so that all of that energy builds to frustration, which can so quickly turn to aggression. And it's this very anthropomorphic view of what would I like as a human being.
Correct.
But that's not even true either, because we need parameters and guidance too. We just don't want it to happen to us, but we resent when it doesn't happen. You know,
And we're able, because we have verbal skills and all the things, to put a lot of fluffy language around a very firm request.
right.
So that's often how we balance it out
Yeah.
culturally or as a
Yeah.
society. So I could say, hey, I really need for you to move. And the fact that I'm holding a gun is absolutely irrelevant because I really care about you. And you're going to be
The
like,
smiley
Lynn,
emoji.
yeah. And they're going to be like, Lynn needs us to move now. So
Yeah.
we do all of that. We can do that kind of mixed signaling. Horses don't handle mixed signals very well.
Yeah.
So you need to go, it's not a gun and it's not a soft snuggle. It's actually the specific thing that I am asking or the boundary that I'm enforcing. It is that thing. We don't have
Yeah.
to fluff it up and we don't have to harden it up. And that's where our own expectations can really come into play. And I think every person who works with horses deals with this, no matter how much of a master they are or how much of a beginner they are, is when you come to your horse and your horse doesn't respond the way that you expected, we do tend to, as human beings, to overlay what we think that means about us or
Hmm.
about what we see the world, how the world responds to us.
Hmm.
Instead of, no, this filly was just a little bit, you know, fresh this morning. That's all, nothing personal. And the
Hmm.
horses, I think, perceive all of those thoughts and feelings that we have and how that clouds our response as just a form of pressure they don't understand and they just want to move away from it. So to the extent that we can balance that out a little bit, I think is helpful. Just like, why do I feel like I need to be so quote soft or ineffective right now? Like
Yeah.
this horse is really asking me for help. Sometimes
Right.
when an animal is asking you for help, it doesn't look like, hey, I was thinking if you could help me out, that'd be super nice. Instead, they're like, I'm going to act like I'm going to bite you until you help me with this boundary that I need set, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't really feel like a gentle request sometimes.
Your point about mixed signals was so good because if you going back to the Southern guy I worked for and those exchanges and the niceties, like, oh, your average exchange has something you want buried in between a nice opener with a closer to soften the whole thing up for whatever reason. And one of my students and I were laughing because she sends me these messages that are that long. And they're always like, "Hey, the weather's nice." Blah, 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 question, blah, 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 right? So what I always do is I scan the question and answer the question, right? And one time she tried to figure out how much I was reading her text, and she sent me something this long, and in there she had announced her pregnancy somewhere, and I had missed that. She was like, "You never read my messages," but it got me laughing because that's every exchange that we have. This is why it's hard for us to understand how horses communicate and think from their perspective. It's because we always have to soften the tone of something that we want and have people read between the lines. And clarity feels very antagonistic to
It
us,
does. In
right?
this,
Like
yes,
think of someone that is direct and generally they are described by at least somebody as an asshole,
correct.
right? So
You. For those of
you're
us who only
yeah,
have audio, Amy and I are pointing our fingers at each other. So
Finger guns.
we've both been called assholes before, shockingly.
But
Um,
I'm not, and you are. So that's the interesting
and
part.
same back because we mirror each other perfectly. I remember, and I didn't mean to make this person cry, but I remember one time I made someone cry. It was the first time, and I'm like so baffled. Like I had said
Yeah.
something what I thought was pretty, I think I'm pretty soft spoken, in fact, but I think I had just continued to make the point that, she kept kicking her horse, he was not going to go. And she just started to cry. And I was like, I'm not understanding why this is
You
happening. And
didn't
for
do the
her,
sandwich. You didn't do the
I didn't,
sandwich.
and she was a cool person, like nothing
Yeah.
against her, but it was just one of those disconnect moments. And that's basically maybe when I think about this thing about listening to your horse, I think of that moment and how confused I was that I did not understand what she was
Well,
trying
so
to
think of
think.
that exchange. You're hired to help.
Right.
You come in to help, and now you're in trouble,
I
right?
know.
So, so consider how hard it is for the average person to understand helping a horse. Is those exchanges are not direct, right? You're supposed to read between the lines of what the actual expectation that is very unspoken and subconscious, right? Is I want some help, but mostly I want to feel good and have fun.
Right.
Even though I'm
Right.
paying you, so I'm offended that you've given me feedback, which could benefit me. Right. So
Right.
when we're talking to horses, we project that in the way we talk is I want to make you feel good. I want you to have a fun time. That's not what horses are about.
No, and I want you to like me. I think that's kind of
Yes.
the thing I really notice with the people I work with, and I noticed it in myself. It's like, hey, I want you to like me. I want you to bond with me, and I want to just put the soft feel face on and have you
Yeah.
respond to that, even though my body is like all over the place. And that's really also not what a horse is about.
Right.
They like you when you're able to communicate with them in a way they understand, not the way that we wish they understood. And sometimes that means we have to be more, it is a lot more of it is mental, right?
Yeah.
But it does come through in our body.
Yeah.
So if we were completely stationary and we used our mind with the horse, if we were like Stephen Hawking's was, and all we could do was very minute eye movements. I don't know how much a horse could respond to the mental presence, maybe somewhat, but our mental processes show in our bodies in very, very subtle ways.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why I feel like it's important for people to understand what they're putting out physically that is not really conscious.
Yes.
And there's the obvious things like remember to breathe,
Right.
remember to try if you can to just open your chest a little, just
Mhm.
try. Um, but there's other things. The way that we habitually do anything is often what we'll bring to the horse. And I like to rush around a lot. I'm a fast walker and a fast talker, and I'm half Italian and my hands are always all over the place. And when I go to do, a session with the horse, I try to keep all that in mind that, hey, that's the way I am naturally. I don't want to totally subdue it. I want to be, quote, natural. But some horses need me to be a little bit more subtle
Mhm.
and nothing personal. That's just what helps them learn better. So it's
Mhm.
not an indictment on the way that I speak or the way that I walk or my viewpoints on the world. It's just what that particular horse needs in order to hear me better.
Yeah,
So,
especially when you're starting out with a new horse, you're always trying to find the way that makes the horse understand you best. How do I move, think, talk, or whatever? How can I be what this horse needs to understand at this point? And then you bridge the gap to the point where the horse can manage real life. But I do think there always has to be some degree of awareness. Like those people that are just unfettered. Like some of those people need to tone it down a little bit just as a way of being, and then have your outlet with people, right?
right.
When you're around horses, there's a certain decorum, so to speak, of just the way horses need people to be without tiptoeing. Um,
Yes,
but with some horses, you have to really dial it in, and with other horses, you can relax a little,
correct.
and it just all depends. But that's where feel feel is the art of adjusting moment to moment, reading the situation, which is why if you can't say no, you can't say you have feel,
No,
because no has to be an option.
it
And
does.
it's not a popular thing to say right now because it sounds mean, but it is the kindest thing you can do for an animal that thrives on clarity.
Correct.
I mean, a herd can't exist without a series of a million no's per day, you know?
Correct. Correct.
And it's not to say you whack them in the chin with a hoof, right?
Yeah. Boss mares are not subtle, you know.
No,
They're not because clarity is so key for safety, right?
exactly.
So if you're out in the wild and you have a horse who maybe has a little bit of a tendency toward anarchy, he's been reading all the wrong philosophers. That
Gotta be
horse is
careful with what they can get.
that horse is going to die. So he better acquiesce
Right.
to the rule of the herd, or the herd will just leave him
Well,
wounded.
this is how I put it toward my anxious students because anxious students need the most guidance. Like I have to have a structure for them. It can't
Mhm.
just be like I teach very free form with more advanced students. Like what would you like to work on? How did you think that felt? Right. But if I get an anxious student in my arena and I'm like, what do you want to work on? How do you think that went? Oh my God, awful. You hated it. I mean, they just start to spiral out of control. And there has to be a look up. I almost talk over them sometimes when they start rambling and getting nervous. I don't try to make them feel bad. But I had one student who was absolutely the most anxious person I've ever met, and she was just petrified of horses and petrified of everything. And so the tone was always very kind and supportive, but it was like, you have to let me lead you, right? And so she would start to, what if, and I would just go back to telling her what to do, and I would keep her very, very focused, and I would count, and we would breathe together, and it was, but the tone of the lesson was there are parameters that I will not let you go down, right? I'm not going to let you spiral out of control about the what ifs. But I, with the feel that I have, hopefully, will not push you to a place that you won't be so overfaced, right?
Right.
Keeping the tone of this lesson very, very simple. All we're doing is walking around the ring. You can handle that. Trust me, let me guide you, right? But every time you bump into a parameter, I'm going to bring you right back. And that helped her so much because she needed help focusing. Because if I let her follow every little squirrel her brain went down, she would have been in a ball in seconds crying. And I didn't overface her, I didn't yell at her, but I just parameters. This is what we're doing and nothing else. Stick to this.
And that's exactly what you do with an anxious horse that you were working with
Exactly.
too.
Exactly.
Exactly. And sometimes that can help an anxious student to say, what I'm doing with you is what I would do with a horse. And
Hmm.
you can do this with your horse too.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
But no
And
judgments, right? Like I do not judge you for your fear. I do not
no,
think do, and that has to be super clear with the horse too. If there is a
right.
parameter you've bumped into, I'm not mad at you. I'm not emotional. I am trying. All
No.
of these corrections are in the intention to help, and that's what I always tell my students with their pushy horses or people with trouble with parameters is you cannot help if you cannot put up parameters. Your corrections are from a place of help.
No, that makes sense. And it, it's also something that can change very quickly.
Hmm.
So I was working with a young horse and breakfast was a little late and I was going to grab some of the food dishes to feed. They were out in the pasture. And sweet young horse, the last time that one of the vets was here, they were a little extra cozy with her. And then we've had some bad weather.
Hmm.
So the last experience maybe that she had was being cuddled a little, not badly, but being cuddled. So I go out there. It's a cold, kind of dampish day. I'm picking up the buckets, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so excited that you're here. I want to come up and I want to be really soft with you." And then she leaned over and she started to push, just a little. Now it was subtle. It wasn't like she lunged at me.
Hmm.
And I was like, "That's a no, thank you." And she was like, I want to push again." And I'm like, "Okay." I got the halter, I got the lead rope, and we just did a little groundwork right there because she needed the parameter of that device at that moment so we could work on something a little. It wasn't that she was being punished. It wasn't
Right.
that she was being bad. It just happened that the last thought in her head from an interaction was coming in more.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I know breakfast is a little late. Sorry about that. But even when breakfast is a little late, we still have our protocol together. And I think if we're physically connected, you'll get this. She was not in any way, quote, misbehaving. I mean, it was very, very subtle, right?
Yeah.
But had I left it unaddressed, it would have been much larger tomorrow. So
Yes.
we did this little session and it was great. It was like, I don't know, 8 minutes, something like that. Not again, not a punishment, just like, hey, remember this, remember this, remember this is how we are together. This is how we are together. And she
Hmm.
was like, right, I remember that. And it was great. It was nice. It was a good opportunity. It was basically how I saw it. Now, I could have seen it as, oh, that's too bad. She's a little pushy. I'm in a hurry. I got to go. I got to feed these guys real quick and then I'm out of here. And
Yeah.
I'm frustrated with her. It was more like, oh, you need a little help right now. Let me help you with that. But it was very small, right?
Yeah.
It was not a big deal because just kind of cleaned it up right there. No
I
big
think
deal.
people don't understand what affection from a horse feels like too. They think affection is the pushy, slobbery, chewing all over you, knocking all your stuff over. And after my horses have been handled by somebody that is a little disrespectful of them and gets them kind of in that space where they're pushy, my horses are always more anxious and they
Mhm.
can't provide affection. And it bums me out because I love sharing affection with them. But the affection that horses give is a much quieter, more subtle kind of affection. The kind where they'll just touch you with their nose or stand near you peaceful. It's very peaceful.
It
And
is
that type of pushy always comes with an anxiety and an agitation and an energy. It's like, that lab that keeps jumping all over you and is so excited.
overstimulated. Yeah,
It's overstimulated. That lab is not being affectionate, it's overstimulated.
right.
People don't understand that with dogs either. They don't know what a truly happy dog looks like half the time because dogs are always so overstimulated and we love that and excite that. So we do it to the horses too. But when my horses have been overstimulated and created cause to push, they cannot share affection because they're not in a peaceful mind frame. So
Correct.
that bums me out because that's not what I want from our relationship, right? I want us to feel peaceful together.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of feel like, well, am I being nitpicky? But it was a nice change that happened just from addressing something very simply instead of being frustrated. And then when we were finished and I took the halter off, she was just standing there very peacefully. She wasn't
Exactly.
worried about the food dishes. She
Yeah.
was, and this was tiny. This wasn't anything a big
Yeah.
deal. But I haven't worked with a horse this young before. So you really see how a couple of interactions can redirect something. They're so plastic right now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, while you're still in Play-Doh mode here, we can just do a quick revisit of this. And also, you're not in a good frame of mind to even get food right now because
Right.
you're not hysterical, but for you, you're a little overstimulated, a little agitated. When I was working with her, her herd mate is my older horse, and he went and put himself under a tree and waited. He's like, we're just going to wait for the food over here. When she's
Yeah.
done, I'm not going to even be part of this because clearly everybody's too overstimulated now. It was funny. Like he went and he put himself in the corner to wait for
Yeah.
when things were back to food time, you know? So
When I
feeding
was,
is a big deal too. So go ahead.
yeah. Well, that was what I was going to get at is when I was running a training barn, it was really hard to drive home how much those things were all layered together because, your clients want to come and see their horses after work and let down and snuggle with their buddy and then get out of there, right? They want to have a
Right.
nice time with friendly Fluffy and then go home. And what would happen is, Fluffy would get fed hay in the barn aisle and then he would get a little treat and then it would one thing he wanted more and then one thing would lead to another and Fluffy's just having a wild, fun time for himself. But then when I go back to training Fluffy, catching him is a problem. Leading him into the barn is a problem. Getting him to hold still for tacking is a problem. And now the leads are a problem and the transitions are a problem because all of these things created these sliding through parameters. And let me just check and see, right? And so it's not like I just have to correct one thing. It's now he's run into trouble in 9 things in succession in a row, which is completely unfair to him because he didn't deserve that, because things were going along fine. And for a self-serving moment of making ourselves feel like we're having a fun time for ourselves, we punish the horse 20 different ways because when I would have lessons with my students after they were, using hay to distract them to help them hold still because they wouldn't hold still because they were afraid to just tie them up. Then they would be arguing with the horse the whole lesson. He won't stop chewing on me. He's not leading well. He's. I'm like, well, don't create those problems and then be mad at it, because it's not fair. If you really want the horse to be tuned into you, you have to tune into them 100% of the time. And you can't have yourself a moment of fun for yourself at the horse's expense without having them come back to bite you. The price will be paid later.
Agreed. And I think, again, going back to the original start of this podcast episode, what does listen to your horse mean?
Right.
Well, it depends, of course, is always the answer, but if I had listened to the young horse this morning, I would have said, "Oh, she needs me to hurry up and pick up these dishes and feed her faster." That's what I hear her saying.
Yeah.
And if I had responded that way, it wasn't like it was going to ruin her, but guaranteed she would have been pushier at dinner time tonight
Yeah.
too, because I'm building in, I'm every interaction, and particularly around food, which is a highly, important thing to a horse. They're going to remember things around food. So I was like, hey, I hear you, and I assess that the feedback that you're giving me now is that you really need to have a reintroduction to how we are together,
Yeah.
and you need a little help calming down and getting ready to enjoy your meal. So let's
Yep.
do that together.
Yep. I
And
can't tell
I,
you how many horses I've had in training that could not enjoy food because of the way it was given to them, where they have food anxiety for a lifetime or aggression around food. And they everybody wants to think they've been abused, and that's why they're so aggressive around food. And half the time it's the horse banging on the stall door and people are like, "Oh, I'm sorry, here's your food." And what you're pairing is an anxious or aggressive mind and food. And there you have a horse who cannot enjoy food.
yeah, it's a
They
fascinating
choke, they
combination.
colic, they stress, they get ulcers. I mean, that's just a travesty because, every boarding barn you go down, just about, horses are banging on the stall wall. People are feeding, after they bang. And these horses are getting ulcers and stress and all kinds of stuff simply because they don't have good parameters, not because they're being abused. They
And
have
I, yeah.
care poor parameters.
Oh, exactly. And I can't say that I'm pristine about it, but I feed typically out in the pasture, but
Mhm.
there's rules. That's all. So you can't rush at me. I throw it over the fence, but you can't rush at me. You can't have your ears in a bad expression or your face.
Yeah.
And when I put the food down, sometimes you might have to wait if I feel like you don't quite have the right
Hmm.
vibe. Not to be mean, but because I want you to come to your food in a certain state of mind. And
Yeah.
it's the thing that we spend the most time consistently doing with our horses if we have our horses at home is feeding them.
Yeah.
We do that
Yeah.
every day, unless we're really bad horse owners. So it's a small, steady thing to do every day, without having to be mean about it. And they always appreciate it. I
Yeah.
have one horse here who's super anxious about food. He was at the track a long time. He's like running around, and then when I come with the food, if I have the flag, he's like, "Oh, thank God." And he goes and he kind of stands and he waits, and then when the food comes down, it's peaceful. It's not a big deal. But if you didn't do that, he would just run around and
That's what I try to teach people with the rehabs when I was doing a rehab barn is if your horse has got food anxiety or ulcers or choking, they have to have food parameters and it will help them. It's going to be a pain in the beginning because you have to repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. You're going to take a little more time. But the only way for this horse to be calm with food is to reprogram the loop. They have to have enough food, obviously, if they've been anxious about not having enough food. But without parameters within a herd and with you have to be able to walk safely around that horse while you're putting food down, or they're going to eat so fast they choke, or they're going to give themselves stress ulcers. It's not a fair life for a horse.
no. And if they're in a herd and they're behaving that way, the other horses will run them off the food or create
Exactly.
tension because they don't want to be
Exactly.
around that either. So you're kind of helping everybody by setting the table for them. Like, hey, this is how we eat. I think horses kind of have a little bit of the Edwardian era manners around them. Like, you really want to set up these very courteous, very formal parameters, so to speak, around things like food. And now we're doing the first course, and we always say please and thank you. And there's these very elegant parameters, and we're not used to thinking that way in the modern era, but
Right.
you kind of have to see it that way sometimes.
Well, that was another big part of the rehab program for me was putting those horses that were kind of Looney Tunes into my herd. And the herd will not tolerate the weirdo. They don't like the one that doesn't get along. It can't figure out the social norms. And so that horse is not going to get enough hay and he's not going to get enough water until he figures out. Of course, I made sure that there was hay out everywhere because I don't want him to starve. But that's a big part of survival for a horse is a horse cannot learn parameters. They can't survive. Out in
Right,
the wild, the a-hole gets kicked out.
right, right.
So we actually are encouraging aberrant behavior on our horses. We're encouraging behavior that would get the horse killed. And so they naturally feel at disease. They don't feel at ease because they don't have structure. They crave structure. They need it to feel peaceful.
Yeah, they're herd animals by design. So even if they're never in a herd, it's what biologically they crave.
Yeah, the factory makes them like that.
Right. It's a factory setting that is not unflippable. Like
Can't turn it off.
you can't turn it off as much as we try. But well, cool. Well, we're getting to the kind of the end of the time allotment here. Is there something else you'd like to say on this topic of listening to your horse?
No,
Since it was your topic, so
I think that was a really fun discussion. I think we hit it from all ends, but yeah, I guess we can just finish with saying the horse can't be straight without parameters. So they're never going to have the experience of feeling good in their body without having good parameters in their life. So if you really want the horse to feel peace, emotional and physical, there's no way around that.
and that's how you listen with actual respect.
Yeah.
You're not just hearing something, you're actually listening. You have to provide that extra layer of context.
Yes, respecting
So,
the horse's nature and not trying to
correct,
shift it into something that is a fun experience for us because it's about stewarding them.
correct, correct. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Amy, as always. It was super fun to
Good. I
talk
had
with
fun
you.
too.
Okay,
Let's do it
good.
again.